The rain drummed softly against the car's windshield, turning the streets into a shimmering blur of neon and streetlights. Keanu sat in the back seat, his face partially illuminated by the faint glow of passing traffic. It had been a long day. Meetings, press interviews, photo shoots. He should have been exhausted, but something about the atmosphere inside the car kept his mind alert. David, his driver, kept both hands tightly on the wheel. His grip was tense, his shoulders slightly hunched. Keanu noticed the way his fingers twitched every few minutes, the way his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror as if checking something or someone. It wasn't the first time Keanu had noticed these small, almost imperceptible details, but tonight for some reason they felt heavier. The car was warmer than usual, and Keanu realized the heater was running despite the relatively mild Los Angeles night. Strange. He had never seen David turn it on before. His eyes drifted across the dashboard, scanning for something, anything that felt out of place. That's when he saw it. A small stuffed toy wedged between the passenger seat and the center console. It was worn, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges, its plastic eyes dull from years of use. Keanu frowned. "Nice toy," he said casually. David stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, yeah, must have been left behind." Keanu nodded, but something in David's tone wasn't convincing. He let it slide, but his mind held on to the thought. As they approached his building, David slowed the car. Keanu's hand reached for the door handle, but then hesitated. Through the reflection in the window, he saw David's face, tired, distant. There was something unspoken in the air, something Keanu couldn't quite put his finger on. Instead of stepping out, he shifted slightly in his seat. "Hey, David," he said, his voice casual but pointed. "You always head straight home after dropping me off?" David's fingers tightened around the wheel. "Yeah, most nights." Keanu tilted his head. "Most?" David cleared his throat. "Sometimes I make a stop, just grab a coffee or something." Keanu held his gaze in the rearview mirror. The pause was just a little too long. The way David said it, just a little too careful. A strange feeling settled in Keanu's chest. He didn't know why, but something told him this night wasn't over yet. Keanu stepped out of the car, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he turned slightly, pretending to check his phone as he watched David through the reflection of the building's glass doors. David sat still, his hands gripping the wheel, his jaw clenched as if battling an internal decision. Then slowly, he exhaled and shifted the car into drive. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned the corner and stopped just a few blocks away. Keanu's instincts kicked in. There was something off, something deliberate about the way David wasn't in a hurry to get home. Keanu had seen this stop before, but he had never questioned it. Until now. He stepped back into the shadows, watching as David leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples before reaching for something in the glove compartment. A flashlight. Then, carefully, he exited the car, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Keanu's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't a coffee stop. David walked toward a narrow alley beside an old convenience store. Keanu followed from a distance, keeping to the shadows. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the streetlights flickering in the damp air. He peered around the corner, eyes narrowing. David knelt beside a pile of cardboard and blankets. And then Keanu saw it. A small figure curled up inside the makeshift shelter. A child. Keanu's breath hitched. He watched as David carefully adjusted the child's blanket, tucking it tighter around their tiny frame. The child stirred, but didn't wake. David sat back on his heels, running a hand through his damp hair, his face etched with exhaustion. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. David wasn't stopping for coffee. He was stopping because this was home. And suddenly, everything made sense. The overheated car, the toy in the front seat, the exhaustion in David's eyes. Keanu clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. This wasn't just another night. This was a reality he could no longer ignore. Keanu remained in the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold night air suddenly felt heavier, pressing down on him as he watched David sit silently beside the sleeping child. Rain dripped from the edge of the alley's awning, pooling around the worn-out blankets that barely shielded them from the damp concrete. David sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled paper bag and carefully opened it. Inside were a few pieces of bread. He hesitated, then tore a piece and placed it beside the child, as if saving it for when they woke up. Keanu's stomach twisted. This man was going to work every day, driving him around in a luxury car and then coming back to this, sleeping on the street with a child. David exhaled and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His exhaustion was evident, not just physical but something deeper, something that came from carrying a burden too heavy for too long. Keanu took a step forward, but his foot brushed against a loose piece of gravel. The soft crunch echoed in the silence. David's eyes shot open, his body tensing as he turned sharply toward the sound. Keanu froze, but it was too late. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension crackled between them like static in the air. David's expression shifted from surprise to something else, something closer to shame. Keanu stepped out of the shadows, his face unreadable. "David," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. David shot to his feet. "Mr. Reeves, His voice wavered, his hands clenching at his sides. He glanced back at the sleeping child, then back at Keanu, as if bracing for judgment. But Keanu wasn't here to judge. He took another step closer, his gaze locked onto David's. "How long?" David's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He looked away. "A while," he muttered. Keanu's chest tightened. "Why didn't you say anything?" David let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "And say what?" "That your driver sleeps on the street, that I can't even afford a roof over my daughter's head." His voice cracked at the last part, and he quickly turned his face away. Keanu's jaw tightened. The city hummed in the background, distant car horns, the buzz of neon lights, but in this alley, it was just them. Just the raw, undeniable truth hanging in the cold air between them. David sighed, running a hand down his face. "I didn't want anyone to know." Keanu stared at him for a long moment. Then quietly he asked, "What's her name?" David's eyes softened. He turned slightly, looking at the child wrapped in blankets. His expression was no longer guarded, no longer defensive. "Emily," he whispered. Keanu nodded slowly, something shifting in his gaze. The weight of the moment pressed heavier on him now. He had seen enough, and he wasn't walking away from this. David stood frozen, his breath uneven, as if waiting for Keanu to react, to say something, to walk away, to do anything but stand there looking at him like that. Like he understood. Like he actually cared. Keanu's eyes flickered toward the sleeping child, Emily. Her tiny frame curled beneath the thin blankets, her small hands clutching the worn-out teddy bear he had seen in the car earlier. The sight did something to him. He had seen pain before, struggle, loss. But this wasn't just misfortune. This was a father drowning, trying to hold on to whatever little he had left. Keanu exhaled sharply and rubbed the back of his neck. "Come on," he said, his voice steady but firm. David blinked. "What?" "Come on," Keanu repeated, nodding toward the car. "You're not staying out here tonight." David took a step back, shaking his head. "No, Mr. Reeves, I can't." "Keanu," he corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And yeah, you can." David's hands curled into fists. "I don't take handouts." Keanu huffed out a humorless laugh, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Good, because I'm not offering one." David's jaw tightened. "Then what is this?" Keanu glanced at Emily again, his expression unreadable. "It's a chance," he said simply. "A chance for you to get back on your feet, for her to sleep in a real bed tonight." David's throat bobbed. He looked down at his daughter, then back at Keanu. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to pretend he could handle this on his own. But the exhaustion, the sheer weight of survival, was cracking through his resolve. Keanu saw it, and he pressed just a little more. "You can stand here all night arguing with me," he said, voice calm, "or you can get in the car, take her somewhere safe, and figure things out tomorrow." He tilted his head slightly. "Your choice." David's breathing was unsteady. His mind raced with every possible way to say no. But then Emily stirred, letting out a soft, sleepy murmur as she pulled the thin blanket tighter around herself. And just like that, something inside him broke. David looked up at Keanu, defeated, grateful, terrified. Without another word, he bent down, carefully scooped Emily into his arms, and held her close. She barely stirred, her small head resting against his shoulder. Keanu took a step back, gesturing toward the car. "Let's go." David hesitated one last time. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to accept help. The drive was silent, but it wasn't empty. The weight of the moment filled every inch of the car, pressing against David like an unseen force. He kept his hands tight on the wheel, his knuckles white, his breath slow and controlled. In the passenger seat, Keanu sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed ahead, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. In the back, Emily stirred slightly, shifting in her sleep. Keanu glanced at the rearview mirror, watching her small figure curled up against the seat. The contrast was jarring, a child who should have been safe in a warm bed, instead used to the back seat of a car as home. His chest tightened. David cleared his throat. "Where are we going?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain. Keanu leaned back, stretching his legs slightly. "My place." David tensed. "Number I can't." Keanu didn't look at him. "You can." David's grip on the wheel tightened. "I told you I don't take handouts." Keanu finally turned to him, his expression unreadable. "And I told you this isn't a handout." His voice was calm but carried a weight that made it impossible to argue. "It's one night, a safe place for her. That's it." David inhaled sharply, staring at the road ahead. Every part of him screamed to refuse. But Emily was asleep, warm for the first time in weeks. He couldn't take that from her. Not now. After a long pause, he nodded once. "One night." Keanu didn't respond. He just looked back out the window, his jaw tense. Minutes later, they pulled into the underground parking of an upscale building. The kind David had driven past 100 times but never imagined stepping inside. As he killed the engine, his heart pounded. This felt surreal, like a dream he'd wake up from at any second. Keanu pushed open his door. "Come on." David hesitated before stepping out, carefully lifting Emily into his arms. She barely stirred, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt. He followed Keanu toward the elevator, his steps hesitant. As the doors slid shut, enclosing them in the quiet hum of the moving lift, David swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Keanu exhaled, looking down for a moment before meeting his gaze. "Because someone once did it for me." David stared at him, searching for something in his expression, but Keanu didn't say anything else. He just turned back to the doors as they slid open, and with that, David stepped into a world he never thought he'd be a part of. David stepped inside the apartment, his breath catching in his throat. The space was warm, inviting, far from the cold, impersonal luxury he had expected. Soft lighting cast a golden glow over the sleek but lived-in furniture. It smelled of coffee and something faintly woody, like cedar and old books. He hesitated at the entrance, his arms tightening protectively around Emily. She was still asleep, her cheek pressed against his shoulder. He shouldn't be here. This wasn't his world. Keanu closed the door behind them and tossed his keys onto a side table. "There's a guest room down the hall," he said casually, walking toward the kitchen. "Clean sheets, hot shower, no car seats for beds tonight." David swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to accept kindness without feeling like he was taking something he hadn't earned. Keanu poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the counter toward David. "You don't have to stay," he said, watching him carefully. But if you walk out that door, be honest, are you walking towards something better or just running because it's easier than accepting help? David felt his face heat with something close to shame. He looked down at Emily, her tiny fingers still gripping his shirt in her sleep. He had spent so long fighting, so long carrying this burden alone, that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone else share the weight. He let out a slow, shaky breath and finally nodded. "One night," he murmured. Keanu lifted his coffee, smirking slightly. "We'll see." David didn't argue. He just carried Emily down the hall, stepping into the guest room. It was simple, but to him it might as well have been a palace. He laid Emily down on the bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she curled into the soft pillows with a content sigh. For the first time in months, she looked at peace. David sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face. He thought about all the nights he had spent awake in the car, listening to her breathe, terrified of what tomorrow would bring. He thought about the meals he had skipped, the jobs he had taken, the endless cycle of barely making it. And then he thought about Keanu, a man who didn't owe him anything, who had no reason to care, yet had opened his door without hesitation. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because he understood. David closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope.